All right, today we're jumping into the story of the Naalvar. Now, these weren't just any poet saints from South India. They did something incredible. They kicked off a spiritual revolution that completely reshaped an entire culture, building this empire of faith that, is still standing strong today.
So think about that for a second. How do you win a war? Not with swords and shields, but with a song. It's a pretty wild question, right? But it's actually the key to this whole story. We're about to go back in time to a place full of conflict where the most powerful weapon turned out to be poetry.
Okay, so to really get what these guys did, you got to understand the world they were living in. We're talking medieval Tamilakam, and the whole religious scene was tense. The old Vedic traditions, they were kind of fading into the background. And in the royal courts, the real power players, well, the kings were backing Jainism and Buddhism. For anyone who followed the god Shiva, it must have felt like the lights were going out on their entire faith.
But right when things looked bleakest, something incredible started to happen. A counter-movement. And this wasn't led by generals or armies, nope. It was led by just 4 people, known as the Naalvar, which literally just means the 4. And they were about to start a full-blown revolution with, get this, nothing but their faith and the power of their words.
So, what was their secret? What made them so powerful? Well, they weren't just preaching some complicated doctrine from an ivory tower. No, they lived and breathed this new, super personal kind of devotion. Their real genius was making faith something anyone, and I mean anyone, could connect with. Their own lives became this sort of spiritual blueprint, a roadmap for how any regular person could build their own direct line to God.
And their system, wow, it was so elegant but so deep. They called it the 4 margas, or the 4 paths. Think of it like a soul's journey, step by step. You start with the simple act of service, then you move into the more personal space of ritual. From there, it blossoms into a real friendship with God. And finally, you reach this incredible state of wisdom, of total union. And the craziest part is, each one of the Naalvar is a perfect living example of one of these paths.
So let's dive in. Let's look at those first 2 paths by meeting the saints who walked them. Appar, the ultimate servant, and Sambandar, the divine child.
First up is the Dasa Marga, which is the path of the servant. And the idea here is really simple. It's all about pure, selfless service. You see God as the supreme master, the Andavan, and you see yourself as the humble servant, the Adimai. And the guy who just lived this path, that was the Saint Appar.
Appar's devotion wasn't just in his head. You could see it, you could touch it. He was famous for carrying this little hoe around, and he'd just clear the pathways to temples of weeds and rocks. For him, that simple, physical work was the highest prayer he could offer. And his faith? Absolutely unshakable. I mean, this is a man who survived being thrown into a fiery kiln and even being tossed into the ocean tied to a giant stone. But the stone didn't sink. It floated, carrying him right back to shore. Just incredible. Okay, so after the path of the servant, the soul moves up a level to what's called the Satputra Marga, the path of the good son. See how the relationship is changing? It's not master-servant anymore. Now it's father-son. Devotion here is shown through these really loving rituals, like a puja, and the perfect example of this path is the child prodigy Sambandar.
And the story of Sambandar it's just mind-blowing. Picture this. He's just 3 years old, crying by a temple pond, and the goddess Parvati herself comes down and feeds him milk. But this wasn't just any milk, it was laced with pure divine wisdom. And from that exact moment, he became a poet for God. His very first words, his first hymn, were addressed to Shiva as Appa, as father, and that set the tone for his entire life.
Now, Sambandar's mission eventually led to this legendary showdown with Jain monks at the royal court in Madurai. The story goes he won 3 big tests, healing the king, and then these trials by fire and water where his sacred palm leaves survived while the Jains were destroyed. Now here's where it gets complicated. Later Shaiva texts talk about a really brutal aftermath, the impalement of 8,000 Jains. But, and this is super important, there's no evidence from that actual time period that says this happened. So a lot of scholars today see this story not as a literal historical event, but more as a powerful metaphor for the death of Jain influence at court and the huge political win for Shaivism. All right, the last 2 paths take us even deeper into this really intimate space with the divine. We're going to explore friendship and ultimate wisdom through the lives of the next 2 saints, Sundarar and Manikavasakar. The third path is the Saka Marga, the path of the friend. And here, the whole relationship with God just gets turned on its head. It becomes radically intimate. God isn't some distant king or even a formal father figure anymore. He's a Thojan, a close friend, a companion who's right there with you in your joys and your sorrows. And the person who embodied this, that was Sundarar.
Oh man, their bond was something else. Sundarar's story kicks off on his wedding day, when Shiva shows up disguised as an old man and stops the whole thing, claiming Sundarar is basically his slave. Sundarar, totally furious, calls him a pithan, a madman. And then, when Shiva reveals who he is and asks for a song, he tells him, start right there. Start with that insult. So his very first hymn begins, "O Madman." That set the stage for a friendship so close, so real, that Sundarar would later get Shiva to act as a go-between to settle arguments with his wives. Can you imagine?
And that brings us to the final stage, the Sanmarga, the path of truth or wisdom. This is it. This is the peak of the mountain. It goes beyond all the other relationships to achieve what's called Sayujya, a complete, total, indivisible union with God. The idea is that your individual self just dissolves into the absolute, kind of like a single drop of rain falling back into the ocean. And this profound path is represented by the great sage Manikavasakar.
Manikavasakar was actually a prime minister. His king sent him off with a ton of gold to buy war horses for the army. But on the way, he met his guru, who was Shiva in disguise. And instead of buying horses, he used all the king's money to build a temple. Of course, the king threw him in prison. But then a miracle happened. A whole pack of wild jackals was transformed into a stable of beautiful, powerful horses, and they were presented to the king. It was this incredible display of faith that just operates on a whole different level from worldly logic.
But the legacy of these four saints wasn't just philosophical, It had a real-world physical impact. Through their songs and their travels, they literally redrew the spiritual map of South India and completely transformed the cultural landscape.
Just look at this number for a second. 275. What on earth could that mean?
That's the number of Paral Petra Stalams, temples that were literally sung into holiness by the Naalvar. Think about it. They would travel to a shrine, and by composing a hymn there, they basically certified its divine power. They created this huge, interconnected web of sacred sites. They didn't just visit holy places. Their songs created a holy geography, a map of faith that people still follow to this day.
And that really gets to the heart of their legacy. This wasn't just some flash in the pan. The spiritual revolution these four started over 1,000 years ago, it created an empire of devotion that is still so powerful and so deeply felt today.
And this really brings it all together, doesn't it? You can see the four saints, each one defined by their unique path to God. Sambandar the son, Appar the servant, Sundar the friend, and the Manikavasakar the sage. Even their classic images tell their story. You've got Sambandar with his symbols, Appar with that humble hoe. All of their divine songs were eventually gathered together in the Thirunavukarasar, which is still the absolute foundation of Tamil Shaivism. And so we end up right back where we started. The story of the Naalvar leaves us with this huge, powerful question. They went up against the established religious and political powers of their day, and they won. Not with swords, not with armies, but with poetry and with feeling. It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? Can a personal, emotional connection to the divine actually be a more powerful force for change than any law or any doctrine? Looking at the empire they built on song, well, the answer seems to be a resounding yes.